I grew up in a house where weird things happen often enough that no one really questioned it after a while. It was never anything dramatic, just small things. Doors not staying shut, things being moved slightly out of place. It's the sort of stuff that you brush off because you try to pretend it hasn't happened to begin with. But there were two things that happened to me as a kid that felt different, and I didn't even realize they were connected until years later. The first one was something I ended up calling the lurker, mostly because I didn't have a better word for it. It always stayed by my bedroom door. It didn't walk in or come any closer, but would just stand there, completely still, like a shadow that had somehow materialized. Other times it leaned around the doorframe slightly, almost like it was checking in on me. And every now and then it would be halfway in the hallway, halfway in my room, like it hadn't decided if it wanted to venture in yet. I never saw a face or any detail, just a shape. Now I want to make it quite clear, it never touched me, spoke to me, or crossed the room, but it watched me. That part stuck with me. I could feel it watching even when I tried not to look directly at it. Like when you know someone's staring at you from across a room and your body picks up on it before your brain does, it was like that. Now if I shut a door, it would never stay shut. There were no footsteps or sound of a handle turning or the creak of the hinge. The door would just slowly open again. I got used to ignoring it, which sounds insane now, but kids are weirdly good at adapting to things they shouldn't. I just turned towards the wall, pull the blanket up and pretend it wasn't there. Eventually I'd fall asleep, even if I could still feel it standing in the doorway. Looking back, I think it was just watching and waiting. Because then came the night with the bed. I don't know what time it was certainly late. The house was completely quiet. At first, I didn't even understand what happened. I was dead asleep when something woke me up. And then the mattress lifted. It wasn't slight, not like someone nudged it either, but jerked upwards from underneath me. I remember laying there still, trying to process exactly what happened, and then, before I had time to even think, a third hit came even harder. I froze that time. I had this really stupid childlike thought. If I don't move, it won't know I'm awake. So I stayed flat on my back, staring at the ceiling and barely breathing. Every nerve in my body focused on what was directly underneath me. The idea that there was something under the bed, close enough to touch the underside of the mattress and pushing up against it, was enough to keep me completely locked in place. Getting off the bed didn't even feel like an option. That felt like exactly what it wanted. So instead, I slowly pulled the blanket over my head and just stayed there. I could hear faint sounds underneath after that, small scrapes and thumps. It didn't keep slamming the bed. It didn't need to. It already knew I was awake. I don't remember falling asleep, but I think I passed out from being that tense for so long. But the next night was worse. That was the first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, although I didn't have a word for it back then. I couldn't move. I woke up, and immediately I knew something was wrong. My arms didn't work, or my legs or my fingers, and my chest felt really tight. My eyes were open, but that's all I could do, blink. And the room looked weird, darker than usual, like the shadows were somehow thicker. Everything looked far more scary than it did normally. I tried to call out for my mum, but nothing came out, not a whisper, and then from the edge of my vision I saw by the door was the lurker. But it wasn't standing upright or leaning around the frame. This time it was crouched low, like an animal ready to move. Its shape looked stretched, thinner than I remember, like it had been pulled too tight. And it felt closer. Not physically, but in a way I can't explain. Like whatever distance there had been between us before was no longer an obstacle. And all I could think about was this. It's not staying by the door anymore, and now it knows I can't move. That was the worst part, not just seeing it, but knowing I couldn't do anything. I couldn't run, I couldn't hide, I couldn't even shut my eyes. I was just stuck there, watching it from the corner of my vision, waiting for it to finally cross the room. And it felt like it was about to. Like it had been waiting for this exact moment. And the paralysis broke all at once. There was no warning. I just snapped back into my body like something had let go. And I sat up so fast I felt dizzy and immediately began screaming for my mother. She came running in, turned on the lights and checked under the bed in the hallway, but of course there was nothing. She told me it was just a nightmare, that I probably had scared myself and my body had frozen up, and I wanted to believe that. But it didn't feel like a nightmare. Whatever was under that bed that night, and whatever stood in the doorway all those other nights, felt like the same thing. It felt like it was getting closer the entire time, and I hadn't realized it until it was too late. Thankfully, I never saw it again after that, but I also never slept the same way. Even now, I won't keep anything under my bed, be it boxes, storage, nothing. And people have criticized me for it, saying I'm not using space adequately, but I don't care. I need to know there's nothing under there. Because the idea of something having space to crawl in and start waiting again is enough to keep me awake longer than honestly I would like to admit. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for a long time. My mum has told this story in the same way for as long as I can remember, never changing the details, and she's a very straight-edged, logical person and doesn't exaggerate and lie for effect, and doesn't believe in the paranormal. So when she says this happened, I believe her. When my mum was around 4 or 5 years old, she was living in an extremely abusive environment. Her father regularly hurt her, and he even allowed his friends to abuse her as well. It wasn't occasional or ambiguous, it was continuous, and left her terrified. She's talked about that time with an emotional distance, but it's clear how deeply it affected her. Well, one day after a particularly bad beating she hid in her closet, she was crying and feeling completely alone, and remembers feeling unloved, scared, and emotionally worn down. She's always said that at that moment she felt like it was the lowest point of her childhood. And that's when something appeared with her in the closet. She describes it as being roughly the size of around 4 or 5 feet tall. It had the face of an old man with an upturned, almost pig-like nose, and she remembered its face clearly. It spoke to her and told her that it didn't have any friends either, and that it could be her friend. From that point on, it was just there. She says they spent most of their time together. They played with toys, worked on puzzles, and looked through books. She remembers these moments vividly, not like vague childhood memories, but like time spent with a real present companion, and always described it as a genuine friendship. It was also protective. One time she wandered off into the woods near her home, and it scolded her and guided her back. Whenever adults were around, it would vanish. She said it would crawl under her bed and go into the wall through a small door, but whenever she checked later, the door would never be there. For a long time, my mum believed it might have been something her mind created, a coping mechanism to survive the abuse. That explanation almost made sense, and she accepted it for years, but there's one part of the story that makes this harder to dismiss. The reason my grandmother moved them out of the house changed everything. One day my grandma was walking past my mum's bedroom and heard her talking. At first, she assumed my mum was just talking to herself. Then, she clearly heard a grown man's voice answering her back. Alarmed, she rushed into the room, but there was no one there. When she questioned my mum told her about the little man. The very next day, Grandma moved them out the house. My mum remembers the final night clearly. She says the little man appeared one last time. This time he was angry and upset that she had told her mother about him. He told her they couldn't be friends anymore. After that, he never appeared again. Even now, she still gets sad talking about him. She said more than once, "He was my closest friend back then, and I still miss him." I'm not trying to jump to conclusions about what it was. I honestly don't know. Maybe it really was something her mind created to survive unbearable trauma. But the way she described it and the fact that my grandmother heard a man's voice has always made me wonder if something else was going on. So I'm sharing this here to ask, has anyone ever heard of something like this? Something that appears during childhood trauma, interacts like a real companion, hides from adults, speaks with an adult voice, and disappears permanently when discovered. I'm genuinely curious if anyone has experienced or even heard of anything similar.
When I was around 7, I lived in a house where something strange seemed to happen to almost everyone at some point. Nothing constant or obvious, but it would be small things that never quite added up. Out of everything that happened there, though, there's one night I've never been able to forget. I was asleep in my room with my cat curled up next to me, and as far as I remember, it was a completely ordinary night. Well, at some point, I was suddenly jolted awake by the feeling of my bed shaking. It wasn't a gentle movement either. It was sharp, like something had grabbed the frame and given it a very deliberate shake. It stopped almost immediately, and there was no build-up or explanation for it. And so, I just lay there in the dark, trying to process what had happened while my heart was still racing. The first thing I noticed was that my cat was awake too. She had lifted her head and was looking around, alert. And that gave me a sense of validation, but at the same time made it harder to convince myself it was nothing. Still, I tried to rationalize it the best I could. I remember thinking it might have been an earthquake, even though I live in the UK and that didn't really make any sense. But it was the only logical explanation to come to mind, so I tried to accept it and go back to sleep. Just as I started to settle again, I heard a sound from the foot of my bed. It was a low, deep giggle. It didn't sound right. It wasn't like a normal person laughing. I felt like whatever made that sound didn't fully understand what laughter was or how it worked, and the moment I heard it, the feeling in the room changed completely. I slowly turned my head to look towards the end of the bed, and that is when I saw a dark shape, darker than the rest of the room. It was small, no more than about 3 feet, with what looked like messy, uneven hair sticking out in different directions. Even now, the closest comparison I can make is that it reminded me of something like a goblin, like the kind you'd see in a movie. But seeing something like that in real life in your own bedroom doesn't feel the same as watching it on a screen. It felt completely out of place, like it didn't belong in the room at all. Before I could fully process what I was looking at, it moved. And when I say moved, I mean it dropped out of sight in one quick motion, diving straight under the bed. And that was the moment the fear really set in. Because now it wasn't something at a distance anymore. Now, it was directly underneath me. I could hear it moving under there, subtly shifting, like it was adjusting in place. My cat reacted instantly. She jumped off the bed and backed into the corner of the room, her body low, hissing towards the floor. And she wasn't looking at me. She was focused entirely on the space underneath my bed. And that was what convinced me that this wasn't just in my head. I thought about running to my parents' room, but the moment I imagined getting off the bed, I realized what that would mean. I had a double bed with a wide gap underneath, and to get down I would have to swing my legs over the side and put my feet on the floor right next to where it was. I became completely convinced that if I did that, something would grab my ankles, so I stayed exactly where I was, lying flat and trying not to move at all. At some point, I realized I could hear breathing coming from underneath the bed. It was faint, but clear enough that I could separate it from my own. I even held my breath for a few moments just to be sure, and the sound persisted. That was probably the worst part of the whole experience, because it meant whatever was under there wasn't just moving, but was alive in some way, and I could hear it breathing beneath me. I don't remember falling asleep, but I suppose eventually exhaustion must have taken me, and the darkness took control. My body must have just shut down from being so tense for so long, and when I woke up the next morning, everything looked completely ordinary. There was nothing under the bed, no sign that anything had been under there at all, and the room was exactly as it should have been, which made the whole thing feel even harder to explain. What stayed with me, though, was my cat's reaction. She refused to come back into my room for a while after that, which wasn't like her at all. I had experienced sleep paralysis and night terrors previously, even at that age, so I knew what those felt like, and this did not match. It didn't have that dreamlike quality. This felt clear and physical, and, well, my cat reacted to it. It was fairly obvious. I spent a long time after that checking my room, looking under the bed, trying to find anything that might explain this away, but I never could. The house had other strange moments too, enough that none of us felt completely comfortable in it, but that night stands out more than anything else.
My whole experience with something under the bed is different from other things I've read. When I was around 9 years old, it happened. I had just gotten into bed for the night. My mum had tucked me in and left me in the room for maybe 10 to 15 minutes. My door was cracked open and the hallway light was on, so my room wasn't completely dark. I could see most of it: furniture, the foot of my bed, the doorway. Everything looked ordinary, at least at first. I was laying there, not fully asleep yet, just kind of staring towards the end of the bed when I noticed movement. At the foot of my bed, I saw what I thought was a girl. She looked about my age, maybe a little smaller. She was kind of just hanging there, like her hands were gripping the edge of the mattress and she was pulling herself up just enough to peek over it. Her head and shoulders were visible and she was looking directly at me. I remember thinking very clearly, why is there another kid in this room? But I wasn't immediately frightened. That's the part that always bothered me the most. She didn't look threatening. She wasn't distorted or obviously wrong the way you'd expect in a nightmare. She had dark hair and was wearing what looked to be a light nightgown. Something about it felt outdated though, but I didn't have words for it back then. I couldn't remember her face. Either her hair was covering it completely, or there were no features to focus on. We kind of just stared at each other, and then she giggled. It wasn't especially creepy on its own. It sounded like a normal kid's laugh, almost playful, but it didn't match the situation at all. There was something about the timing that she found funny, and I didn't understand it. Before I could react, she lifted herself up a little higher, and she pushed down on the bed. For context, I had a waterbed at the time, so when she pressed down, it created this very noticeable wave that rolled up towards me. I felt it move under my body. That part wasn't visual or imagined. I physically felt the mattress shift. And that's when the fear hit. Because whatever I was looking at wasn't just something I could see, it could touch things. It could affect the bed I was laying on. Right after that, she shifted her weight forward like she was climbing over the foot of the bed, but instead of just dropping down to the floor normally, she moved like there was a huge drop on the other side, like she was climbing over a ledge and lowering herself before letting go. The closest way I can describe it is like someone throwing their legs over a wall and dropping 10 feet to the ground. That's how she moved. But my bed wasn't that high. It was normal height and there was no drop. Still, she disappeared like there was, and was just gone. The whole thing only lasted a few seconds, but by that point I was fully panicking. I screamed for my mum as loud as I could and she came running in almost immediately, flicked the light on, checked under the bed, checked the closet and everything, but there was nothing there, as the bed had already settled back to normal. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but it came out all scrambled even as a kid. I think part of me knew how insane it sounded, a random girl climbing onto my bed laughing and then dropping off the side like there was a pit in my room. It didn't make sense and still doesn't. Does anyone have any explanation for what I experienced?
This all happened when I was a kid, probably around 6 or 7. At the time, my mum was going through a divorce, and I was staying with my grandma. She didn't want me caught up in everything that was happening, which I understand now, but back then it was really hard. I was in a pretty vulnerable place, and I remember constantly asking my grandma why my mum wasn't coming to see me, and whether I had done something wrong. Kids at school didn't help either. I was new, and they would say things like no one wanted me anymore, or that my family didn't care about me. I didn't know how to process any of that, so I just felt abandoned. Well, one night I was sleeping next to my grandma in her bed. I don't know what time it was, but I remember waking up suddenly to a sound that didn't feel normal. It's hard to describe, but it didn't sound human. It was loud, but it had this strange, unnatural quality to it that it immediately made me feel uneasy. I opened my eyes, and right there, sitting at the side of the bed, was something. Even now, I struggle to describe it properly. It looked like a woman, but not completely. The shape was there, long hair, the hunched posture, but something about it didn't feel right. The hair was extremely dark, darker than anything else in the room, almost like it absorbed the light there was. I could see it clearly, even though the room itself was dim. And then I froze. I don't mean I was just scared. I mean I physically couldn't move. I remember staring at it without blinking for what felt like a long time. My eyes started watering because I wasn't even able to close them. I was completely locked in place, just looking at this thing sitting inches away from me. Under the blanket, I slowly moved my hand towards my grandma, trying to get her attention without drawing whatever this thing was towards me. I started poking her arm, harder and harder, trying to wake her up. And that's when I felt something wet. At first I thought I had hurt her. My finger felt sticky, like there was blood on it, and I remember panicking, thinking I had somehow injured her badly enough that she wasn't responding, but she didn't even move at all. Not even a slight reaction. It was like she wasn't even there anymore. At that point, I didn't know what else to do. I just shut my eyes as tight as I could and began praying. I don't even remember what I was saying, just that I kept repeating it over and over, hoping something would change. And the whole time I could hear it. It wasn't speaking in a language I recognized. It wasn't even forming proper words. It just kept on repeating the same phrase in this low, unnatural voice. Ka, hum, hum. The way it said it didn't sound human. It was uneven. Almost like it was forcing the sound out without understanding it. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually everything went quiet. The sound stopped, and the whole place felt empty. After a while, I opened my eyes, and of course, at that point, there was nothing there. The side of the bed was completely normal. The room looked exactly the way it should have. It was like nothing had ever happened. At some point after that, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up in the morning. I went straight to my grandma and hugged her, trying to ask her about what happened the night before. She looked confused. She told me very casually that I hadn't slept with her that night. I just remember staring at her, trying to process that. I knew where I had been. I knew what I had seen. And then I noticed something else that made it quite hard to explain. I still had strands of her hair in my hand. At the time my hair was short, there was no way it could have been mine. My grandma brushed off the whole thing, saying I must have had a very vivid dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. It didn't fade the way dreams usually do. Every part of it felt too detailed, especially the part where I could actually feel something in my hands. After that, I was too terrified to sleep alone. I made my grandma stay in my room instead, so I wouldn't have to go through that again. But things didn't completely stop. There were a few times after that where I would hear someone call my name from other parts of the house, like the guest room or the kitchen. The voice always sounded like my grandma. It was clear, familiar, and close enough that I would answer back immediately, but whenever I did, there wouldn't be anything there. I would go to her and ask if she had called me, and every time she said no. After it happened a few times, she told me something that I never forgot. She said not to answer it anymore because sometimes negative things can mimic voices to get your attention. I don't know if that's true, but I stopped responding after that. The reason I'm sharing this now is because it wasn't just a one-time thing. Things like this have been following me in different ways for years. Nothing exactly like that night, but enough that I can't completely dismiss it. I'm in my 20s now, and still think about what that thing was saying. Ka-hum-hum. I've tried looking it up, breaking it down, seeing if it matches any language or phrase, but I've never found anything that makes sense. It didn't sound like real speech, and if anyone has ever experienced anything remotely similar or has any idea on what it could have been, I'd really like to hear it. For some context, this all took place in an old house I lived in as a very young child. The house had been repurchased and renovated at least 50 years before we moved into it, and it's where I grew up until we moved out when I was about 5 years old. I lived there with my mother, father, older brother, and older sister. The house was on John Street, near what is now Port Dalhouse in St. Catharines. Years later, my sister told me that the building might have originally been used as some kind of stationary military hospital. I have tried to verify that, but I haven't been able to confirm it with complete certainty. What I have been able to find out is that Port Dalhousie was considered strategically important during various wars because of the port and railway routes in the area. So it's not impossible that the house had some kind of connection to that history. I don't know if that detail actually matters, but it always felt relevant given what happened in the house. The reason I bring this up is because I wasn't the only one who experienced something unusual here. My siblings both had their own experiences, and neither of them has any history of hallucinations or anything like that. My sister told me that one night she felt a presence standing in the doorway to her room. When she looked, she could make out the outline of a person, but it was transparent. She said it looked like a figure wearing what she thought was an RCMP-style hat. She could see the shape clearly enough to recognize it, but at the same time, she could see straight through it. She described it as faint, almost like it was barely there, but still very real, and this happened at night, and stuck with her. My brother had a separate experience at the same house. He said he saw a figure in the hallway outside his bedroom. According to him, it looked like a slightly opaque white light, shaped like a woman wearing a dress. He described it to something that moved across the doorway and down the hall, almost like it was just passing by. Like my sister, he doesn't have any history of hallucinations or anything that would explain it away easily. I wanted to establish all of that before getting into my own experience, because unlike them, I never actually saw anything in the house. What happened to me was different. So as a child, I was very easily scared. I was afraid of the dark, afraid of thunderstorms, and I remember being extremely claustrophobic. I wouldn't even go to the bathroom at night without being terrified, and I definitely wouldn't go near the space under my bed. Like a lot of kids, I had that fear that something might grab me if I got too close to the edge, which is why what happened doesn't make sense to me, even now. So one morning I woke up in complete darkness. I was disoriented trying to figure out where I was, and then I realized I was under my bed, not partially under it, but all the way underneath, wedged between a wall and some suitcases that my parents kept there. I was completely surrounded with barely any space to move, and I immediately panicked. I began screaming because nothing about it made sense. I had never sleepwalked before, not then and not at any point since. And even if I had, I was the last kid who would willingly crawl into a tight, dark space like that. It went against every fear I had at the time. My mum and sister heard me screaming, but couldn't figure out where it was coming from at first. Eventually they found me under the bed and pulled me out. I remember them being confused, asking how I got in there and why I would do that. I didn't have an answer because I genuinely didn't know. The strangest part is that it didn't just happen once. From what I remember, it happened multiple times while we lived in that house. Not every night, but enough that it became a pattern. I don't remember each individual incident clearly, but I do remember the feeling that every time I woke up like that, it would be the confusion, the fear, the sense that I had ended up somewhere I never would have chosen to go. I never asked, but I suspected my parents may have eventually rearranged things or blocked off the space under the bed after it happened more than once. At some point it stopped, and we moved out of that house when I was 5, and after that it never happened again. What always stayed with me is how out of character it was. I was a child who was afraid of the dark and terrified of confined spaces, and yet somehow I kept waking up in one of the worst places I could imagine at that age. I never saw anything like my siblings did, never witnessed a figure or a presence, but something about that house didn't feel right to any of us. It's been at least 40 years now, and I still don't have a real explanation for it. I can only describe it as accurately as I can remember it, but even now, looking back, it doesn't feel like something I can easily explain as normal childhood behavior. Has this happened to anyone else? When I was younger, I had a lot of issues with sleep. I don't remember a whole lot of my childhood, but I know I couldn't sleep for long periods of time, and frequently bothered my parents in the middle of the night. I'd have recurring nightmares, terrors, and would talk in my sleep. I'd freaked out my dad many times when I'd get up and wait for him to finish whatever he was doing. A 6-year-old girl in a nightgown with long hair hanging off her face was a freaky thing to see at 2 a.m. Anyway, from as far back as I can remember until I was around 8 years old, I had the same dream nearly every night. My bed was right under a big window, and I liked to sleep with the curtains partially open so I could look at the moon. It was a 1-story house and my bedroom was at the front, and every single night, and I truly mean every, I would dream that I woke up to see a humanoid creature outside my window. It was extremely tall, tall enough that I could see most of its body framed by my window. It had greyish yellow skin and wore no clothes. Its shoulders reached the very top of my window and its torso was nearly the whole length of the window, but I could see the tops of its legs towards the bottom. It had its hands pressed into the glass and its fingers splayed out. Then the real freaky part. Its neck reached above the window and then looped back down so that its head was visible to the side of its body. It had no hair, massive grey-white eyes, 2 slits for a nose, and a giant grin on its face, and I mean giant. It stretched its skin out on its cheeks and chin, and its teeth were long and jagged and thin, and they were a dirty yellow color. It never did anything, didn't even blink, and just stood there staring at me until I'd wake up from a panic. I saw this creature every night for years. I never told my parents about it. I tried shutting my curtain when I went to bed, but when the dream started, my curtains would be inexplicably open. And then, when I woke up, they'd be partially open as if I'd never closed them. Eventually, I told my grandma about the dream when I slept over the house, and didn't have the dream for the first time in years. and she gave me this tiny clay figurine and told me to sleep with it beside my bedside and that I'd never have the bad dream again. I did, and as she said, inexplicably, I never did see the creature again. I still had night terrors and recurring nightmares, but that specific creature never returned. I'm 23 now, and still sleep with the figurine at my bedside. I've never seen that thing again. I am an insomniac, and have experienced sleep paralysis a number of times in my adult life, frequently experienced night terrors, and have been prescribed a number of sleep medications that I never ended up taking long term because of the side effects. At this point, I'm very good at running on little to no sleep. I have experienced hallucinations during sleep paralysis where I've seen horrible things and had dreams that have left me messed up for days. Still, I have never seen that creature again. The memory of those dreams is the clearest memory of my childhood that I have. I can remember exactly how it looked, exactly how it felt to lay in bed and stare at it between my purple curtains, exactly how silent and still it was. I don't ever open my blinds at night. I don't particularly believe in the supernatural. I take a firm, it's probably not real, but just in case it's not, I'm not going to mess with it stance on any of that stuff. I hear paranormal stories and immediately consider all the regular things like sleep deprivation and carbon monoxide poisoning before I assume ghosts. I have never experienced anything paranormal in my life, aside from this. I truly 100% believe, however, this was not a natural thing that happened. I could forgive it as a recurring dream or childhood nightmare, but it happened too regularly and far too frequently to think that. I don't know what it was or why, but I really don't think it was something normal or easily explained. So that's my story. I don't like talking about it too much, but perhaps sharing this in this medium might be therapeutic. I guess only time will tell. Something has been going on in my childhood bedroom for a few years now, and I could really use some outside input. I've always felt sensitive to energies or presences, and certain places or types of paranormal media give me intense dread. My family is kind of the same way. A lot of us have had strange experiences or bouts of paranoia, specifically in a shared family home in Massachusetts. So part of me wonders if certain environments just affect us more strongly. So, about 2 years ago, I started hearing a buzzing or tapping sound from the left side of my window. It was always in the exact same spot. It sounded like something rattling inside the wall, and it only happens during the daytime. My dad checked the windows for me and couldn't find anything wrong. Around the same time, I developed a very intense feeling of being watched at night, especially when I turned my back to the window. I always felt like whatever this presence is, it was lurking right outside the window. Like something is squatting just beyond the glass, unable to come inside, but its face was inches away from my bed, like it pushed all the way up against the wall. The feeling is always the same, like it's watching and observing. But even with that, I don't feel just mild discomfort. It's a wave of dread that hits instantly. Sometimes I get so terrified I turn back around and I have to hype myself up for several minutes before I'm able to look, close the window and lock it. Then I shut the blinds as quickly as possible. This is a complete shift from how I used to be. I used to sleep with the blinds open and the windows cracked because I liked the nighttime ambience and hearing outside sounds. Now, I can't even relax if the blinds are slightly open, and this feeling and activity only happens in this room. I never get that feeling in any of my other apartments, or at least it didn't last. One day I suddenly felt claustrophobic, like the air in my room was really heavy, but this could have just been my anxiety though, and my room felt unfamiliar, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Or later that night, between 12:30 and 3 a.m., I could hear heavy breathing from under the bed. It sounded like a grown man panting or exerting himself, and it felt directed at me. I panicked and called my sister to check. She didn't see anything, and when I checked again myself, there was nothing there. But the feeling lingered for the rest of the night. Since then, I occasionally still heard muffled breathing, but now it comes from the wall and window area behind my head. It happens in the daytime too. Around when all of this started, I had moved a printed copy of a painting into my room. It shows two women lying in a jungle while animals stare at them from between the leaves, especially a tiger-like creature with big, round, unblinking eyes. The way it stares at the women is exactly how I imagined the presence outside my window staring at me. To help myself feel safer, I sometimes try to imagine the tiger is protecting me by looking outward, but honestly, the gaze creeps me out more than it comforts me. Also, this might be coincidence, but it still freaks me out. That same night I heard the breathing under my bed, my twin sister told me she'd been watching one of the Conjuring movies. That psyched me out because I've always asked my family not to watch those in the house, since they're based on true stories and I don't want to risk inviting anything in. And this isn't the first time something weird has happened after one of those films. Years ago, I heard scratching and tapping inside the wall between my room and my older sister's. That wall is just our closet back to back, so there's no open space in there. Months later, my sister said she heard the same noises and told me they started right after she saw the Conjuring movie in theaters. So the fact that another family member was watching one on that same night, when I heard the breathing under my bed, honestly made everything feel worse. So I guess I just wanted insight on whether or not this could be a spirit or something, or if I'm indulging my anxieties and extreme paranoia. I am genuinely open to any explanations. This isn't my story directly, but one my mother shared with me years ago, and has always stuck deep in my subconscious. She was in her preteen years at the time, living in our family home in Riverton, Utah. According to her, that house had a long history of strange things happening. Not just one or two isolated instances, but repeated experiences over the years. Eventually, my grandmother became convinced something was wrong with the house and tried to cleanse it in a religious way, but that came later. What happened to my mum took place before any of that. But one night she was lying in bed reading, starting to drift off while still holding the book. Now it was quite late and completely normal up to that point when out of nowhere she heard a sound that woke her up instantly. It was a growl. Not just any growl, but something deep enough that she said it felt like it vibrated through the bed itself. It didn't sound like any animal she had ever heard before, not in real life or TV, and it came from directly underneath her bed, close enough that there was no mistaking where it was coming from. The sound alone was enough to lock her in place. She said she couldn't move, couldn't even think properly at first. She just lay there completely still listening, and after a few seconds the fear set in fully, and she started crying. But not loudly. The growling didn't stop right away. It continued for a while, like a warning rather than an attack. Then, gradually it changed. It turned into barking. She described it as a deep and unnatural as a growl. Spaced out, like whatever it was making sounds to test it. At that point she couldn't stay quiet anymore. She finally tried to scream for her parents who were in the next room, but as it turned out she didn't need to. Right as she screamed, her bedroom door opened almost immediately. She always believed they must have heard it too because the timing was too exact to be coincidence. The moment the door opened, everything stopped. Not just the barking, but all sound in the house. It was like something had been cut off mid-action. And the silence that followed wasn't natural either. My grandparents came into the room and tried to calm her down, then grabbed a flashlight and checked under the bed. They told her there was nothing there, No animal or object or anything that could have made those sounds. At the time, that was the end of it, or at least from her perspective as a kid, but she was shaken, and eventually everyone moved on from it, at least outwardly. Years later, though, my grandparents told her something they hadn't said that night. When they shined the flashlight under the bed, they didn't actually see the floor or wall behind it. The beam of light didn't illuminate anything the way it should have, but more just disappeared. They described it like the light being swallowed, like there was a space directly under the bed that wasn't reflecting any light back. They couldn't see the back wall, they couldn't see the underside of the bed frame or the box spring. It was just dark. They didn't tell her that at the time, of course, because she was already terrified, and they didn't want to make it worse, but it clearly stuck with them enough that they eventually told her later in life. Not long after that incident, my grandmother started going through the house room by room, loudly praying and demanding that whatever was there, that it should leave. She would repeat phrases like, "In the name of Jesus Christ, leave this house," over and over. According to my mum, the activity in the house eventually stopped after that. I don't know what to make of it. It's the only under-the-bed story I've ever heard from someone in my own family, and it's always felt different from the usual stories people tell. Either way, it's one of the things that I've never forgot after I heard it. For context, this isn't happening to me, but to one of my parents. They live alone in a small, single-family ranch house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. They have no pets or roommates, and there's no weird history with the house as far as we know. On the surface, it's completely ordinary, which is why this has been messing with us so much. Every single night, at exactly 9:44 p.m., they hear 3 loud knocks coming from under the bed. It's not random noise, it's knocks. Evenly spaced, as if someone were knocking on the door, 3 in a row, the same rhythm and volume every night. At first, they brushed it off. Houses make noises, especially older ones. But then it keeps happening. It was always the same 3 knocks, right at 9:44, always the exact same time. That's when it stopped feeling ordinary. Of course, they checked under the bed multiple times and there was nothing there. No storage or loose objects, nothing that could really account for the noise. They even checked within the mattress itself, just in case something had gotten in it. But of course, nothing had. The bedroom sits directly above the garage, so that was the first logical explanation, maybe something mechanical. Garage door system, a timer pipe expanding, something like that, and they tested it. For several nights in a row, they waited in the garage for 9:44 listening and nothing happened. But the next night, when they went back to their normal routine and were actually in bed at that time, the knock came right on schedule. And that, of course, is when they began to feel targeted. Like it only happened when they were in one place and they'd hear it. We went through everything we could think of. There was no plumbing or HVAC running between the garage ceiling and the bedroom floor. No pipes or vents, nothing that could expand or contract on a timer. No smart devices, no automation, no security system that could be triggering anything. They have 2 outdoor cameras as well, and neither has ever picked up anyone around the house at that time. At one point, I even considered the idea of a Frogger, someone secretly living in the house. But there's nowhere for someone to be. No crawl space access, no gap between the garage, ceiling and the bedroom floor big enough to hide a person, and definitely no way for someone to get under the bed itself without being seen. And even if there was, why would they knock 3 times at the exact same minute every single night for months? The level of consistency feels spooky. I haven't personally heard it, which honestly makes it worse in a way, because my parent isn't the type to imagine things. They're not dramatic, not into anything paranormal, and were genuinely frightened when they shared this with me. It's not just the knocking. Around the same time, they began noticing smells in the hallway outside the bedroom, strong ones, cigarette smoke even though the house holds no one who smokes,
and occasionally the smell of feces, not faint either, but strong enough that they'd check the house thinking someone had gotten in or something had spoiled. But there never was anything there. The smell would just appear, linger, and fade like a phantom farter. Then there's the timing of everything. A few weeks ago, an estranged relative of ours died. He was abusive, and to be blunt, no one in the family mourned him. But what's strange is the knocking didn't start after he died, it started before, and then continued after without changing at all. If this was some kind of death knock, or a symbolic thing, you'd expect it to line up with that event somehow, but it doesn't. It just exists on its own schedule. At one point I tried to do something about it, sage the house. I didn't expect much, but figured it couldn't hurt. Not long after that, my parent, who's never been religious, started going to church. I didn't push it, they just felt like they needed to. And since then everything stopped. The smells, the knocking, all gone. And that should feel like a relief, but honestly it doesn't. Because whatever it was didn't fade out gradually or just stop. Anyway, I'm still trying to figure out if there's a rational explanation we missed, something structural, environmental, anything. I'd honestly prefer that. Because the part that bothers me the most isn't the noise itself, but how precise it was when it was there, and how it left when we involved the sage and religion. What are your thoughts? I've been having a situation with a phantom since July. One night I stayed up because I had a final exam the next day. I wasn't asleep all night. It must have been around 5:40 a.m. when I heard a sound from the living room. It was like a melody, but made by punches on the table. My dog was with me, and my cat sleeps with my mother. At first I thought that someone somehow entered the apartment, although I live on the 10th floor, and the person was playing before doing something horrible. I exited my room, went to the living room and found nothing. The dog followed me, and after that, the cat wanted to go out my mother's room. I was standing there in the hall thinking, what was that? I was standing with my dog until my cat entered the bathroom, and I heard a shh from there. My dog got scared, and seeing him frightened scared me too, and we ran to the room and closed the door. Then I told that to my best friend. We tried to make fun of it, trying not to make it scary, but the idea came. Why not make a Ouija board session and see what happened? She came over to my house for a sleepover. We made a homemade Ouija board and bought a planchette in a parade. Then we began playing. An entity responded. We began speaking to him and asked yes or no questions because apparently he was a foreigner who couldn't understand our language. He could barely write his last name, Stiev, and gave us a lot of info about himself, like his nationality, what he was doing in our country, and the years he spent in our country, and other things. My BFF and I took it with a grain of salt, because there were things that historically accord with what happened in the country, like the massive wave of European immigrants in the years he told us he came. But then the constant manifesting started, and at first it was aggressive, like my hair being pulled from nothing. Same with my clothes, noises from the loneliest of places in the apartment. Then, touches, feeling like someone pulling my clothes. I then started to chat with a guy on Instagram, and at the moment I didn't realize he was attracted to me, and after that conversation I wanted to put on my pajamas and sleep. But when I was taking off my clothes, I looked in the mirror and saw a face that wasn't my own, but that of an angry man. I thought it was an optical illusion. Since my best friend had stayed over the night before, and I hadn't put away the mattress she used, I placed it where the face had been, and it remained for a few seconds before vanishing. He told us later he was jealous and appeared in reflections of windows or family pictures when I talked to a guy who he noticed was attracted to me. We asked him, he got angry, but admitted he was a jealous phantom. I thought about the possibility that it was all my imagination, that the Ouija board somehow just worsened my mental health, because I have a history of mental health issues and on occasion have hallucinated because I have post-traumatic stress disorder and borderline personality disorder. Now, I am much better and have learned to handle the symptoms. I haven't had hallucinations in nearly 2 years, but still consider that they could be possible. When I commented this to my mum, she confessed my sister woke up many times in the night because she felt something pulling her bedsheets. I was now concerned because I knew her cousin ended up possessed after a ghost from a Ouija board session. With that in mind, I didn't want her to believe that there really was a ghost in the house, and with all the data he gave me through the months, I investigated on a government website with information about European immigrants and the years he told me he came. Surprise, surprise, there was his name. A bit longer, Tobias Stielverman, and all the data he told me matched with that person. It took me 2 days to process that I had proof that he existed, and that he was in the country, and the years he told me. And I discovered things he didn't tell me because I never asked, like that he got married in Germany to a woman from that country. Tobias was murdered in 1914, so obviously his wife waited for him to come back, and that broke my heart. So the question comes because since I asked him about his real name and started calling him Tobias instead of Stiev, he became a little sweet suddenly. With time, he has become less aggressive than before. I needed to ask, is this normal for a ghost?
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. You might want to check under your bed before you go to bed tonight. I hope you enjoyed tonight's collection of scary stories, and if you did, I would love to get your comments down below. I'll be back on Saturday with a nice chunky compilation to finish off the weekend. I'd like to give an extra special thank you to my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you were to go over to Patreon now, you will actually find a very interesting video about hospital scary stories. And tomorrow I am going to be publishing an episode on witches completely free over on Patreon if you'd like to listen in. But until then, I wish you all a very safe and pleasant night. And I'll see you next time.